This is a Parshat podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Welcome back to the Matan Podcast, where this year we're exploring the weekly Haftorah portion. For those of you who listen weekly, sponsoring an episode can be a great way to honor a memory, a friend, and even mark a momentous occasion. For more information, contact me at podcast@matan.org.il or the Matan office. Parshat Vayishlach opens with the fraught encounter between Esav and Yaakov. Yaakov prepares for the worst, and in the midst of his preparations, experiences an unusual encounter which leaves him physically injured. Yaakov and Esav meet and avoid dangerous conflict, but they somewhat disappointingly part ways again. At the end of chapter 33, Yaakov gives Esav the impression that he will follow him back to Seir, but no such journey is ever undertaken. We get the sense that Yaakov is relieved to have established positive ties with Esav, yet still prefers to live far away from him. The difficult episode that follows, the rape of Dinah, fills in gaps regarding the children's relationships, perhaps best read against chapters 29 through 30, describing the tense dynamics between Yaakov and his wives. Each subfamily knows where its loyalties lie, and the text emphasizes that only Dinah's full brothers come to her rescue. The Parshat continues with God calling Yaakov back to Beit El, giving him purpose of travel after being seized with fear that the Shechemites might harm him to avenge his son's behavior. When Yaakov fulfills God's commandment to travel and build an altar, his name is changed for a second time to Israel. Rachel tragically dies, giving birth to Binyamin, completing the family tree in the saddest of ways. Finally, the Parsha lists the descendants of Esav and the kings and chiefs of Edom, all associated with Esav's descendants. While Esav will reappear in 35:29 to bury Yitzchak, this is the formal way the book of Breishit parts with Esav, as it did earlier with Ishmael. The Haftorah read in all communities is the one-chapter book of Ovadia, the shortest work in all of Tanakh, which is couched in the work we call Trei Asar, which we spoke about in depth in the previous episodes. More on the book of Ovadia in a moment. I'm thrilled to welcome back longtime Matan faculty member Rabbbanit Nechama Goldman Barash. Hi, Nechama.
Hi, Yosefa.
Who teaches contemporary halacha and Talmud at Matan Podcast, as well as a midrashic Torah Avodah. She's an active member of Beit Hillel and a graduate of Matan's Hilchata program, and is also a Yotzat Halacha and Halachic fertility advisor. She's the author of Uncovered: Women's Roles, Mitzvot, and Sexuality in Jewish Law. Nechama, I'm really happy to sit with you for this episode and this content, which I think is safe to say is like far from topics we usually talk about.
Absolutely.
We're far from sort of the halachic spaces that we often like to schmooze about, which is fun, and both of us like a challenge. So here we are speaking about the book of Ovadia.
Yes, and just one thing, when you gave the introduction, you left out one, I think the most poignant part in the Parsha is where Yaakov is expecting real conflict, violence, harm, and Esav comes running and he hugs him and he kisses him and he cries. I think that's really one of the most emotional parts of the Parsha, and whatever his intentions were, and maybe they were to harm Yaakov, when he sees him, he's overwhelmed with an emotion that really speaks to this fraternal relationship, these twins who shared a womb, and in one moment, the whole scene changes, and there's a sense of real reconnection.
Yeah. Which I think is a surprise to everyone, meaning also to Yaakov and also to all of us who are holding our breaths. And again, we know then the story, but if we didn't know then the story, we also would think that Esav is going to do what he set out to do, which is to kill Yaakov.
And possibly even to Esav himself. Mm-hmm. And the reason I want to highlight that is we're going to see Ovadia takes a very different approach to Esav, the character of Esav, the role of Esav in our history. But I think it's important to go back and really focus on that pasuk, which holds so much potential for a different kind of reconciliation and future moving forward.
Okay, that's a really important point. So we'll circle back to that, I think. Mm-hmm. So I think I just want to set the scene. I think it's safe to say that most people haven't recently read Ovadia, and that, well, we're lucky that the whole book can be covered in one Haftorah. It's not even that it's a small book, it's one chapter, and it's very short. It's only 21 psukim.
The entire book is one chapter, exactly. And the last time I really looked at it was in Michlala, which was many decades ago, where I wrote a paper on it.
Oh, that's impressive. So it's part of those, Ovadia, Nahum, and like those books in the middle of Trei Asar that, again, again, thankfully we have this minhag to read these Nevi'im, or else Be'emet, I think we wouldn't know about it at all. So let's just place where we are. Now, the Ovadia never gets identified. We don't know who he is. We don't know. It's not about him, the figure. We don't really know anything about him. But the entirety of this prophecy is aimed at Edom. Okay, so it opens up Ko Amar Adonai Hashem leEdom. Okay, that this is being addressed to them, and we'll talk about what the main themes are of this one chapter work. But essentially, it's a prophecy of doom to Edom. Okay, there's nothing positive about it. We'll see in the end the positive tidings that it's trying to share with us, meaning with Yaakov. But it's a prophecy of doom, and in that way, it connects to the genre of prophecies of doom that we have in all of our major prophetic works, right? That we have in Yirmiyahu, we have in Yechezkel and Yeshayahu, where we have sort of these big, I would say, long units of these prophecies about the fall of our neighbors, who all are our enemies as well. And so, on one hand, it connects to that genre of fall, but what's different, and it connects very much to the point you're bringing out about the Parsha, what's different about Ovadia is that it's not just about Edom as the enemy nation, who just remember is basically situated in modern day Jordan, and is sort of also part of what is sort of we consider still the south of Israel, sort of the area of the Dead Sea. It's a very stark topography that belongs to Edom, which I think is interesting to think about that. But the piece that's really draws us in and what clearly connects us to our Parsha is that we're speaking about Edom here as a descendant of Esav. And right in the middle of the chapter, in the 10th verse, it turns to Edom as a brother, okay? In Pasuk Yud it says, Michamas achicha Yaakov techascha busha v'nichreta leolam. Because the outrage to your brother Jacob, this is why disgrace will engulf you and you will perish forever. And so then it takes like this shift and it goes deep into, it's not just bad enough that you're an enemy of Israel and we have this doom prediction about you, but you were an evil sibling to Yaakov. And so it really cuts into the personal piece. And that is what is important to note, because the first 10 psukim of Ovadia are almost repeated verbatim, word to word, in Yirmiyahu.
So I wanted to actually talk about that there is similarity. Yirmiyahu is not talking about Edom in his prophecy, but the language, and really you could set it out in a chart and have them side by side, and the language is startlingly not just similar, almost identical in some of the psukim, and that leads the Abarbanel to say, the text of this prophecy of Yirmiyahu in chapter 49 is virtually the same as that of Ovadia. How could this be? Didn't the sages teach no two prophets use the same style? And his answer is no, the same style is only about Moshe. Moshe was singular in the language he used in the prophecy he receives from God. But other prophets in their prophecies would actually get general outlines from God and then fill it in with their language, and then it doesn't become as surprising that prophets may have borrowed language from one another to fill in their outline.
They heard each other, meaning Micha and Yeshayahu. We know that Micha was a student of Yeshayahu. We would say the opposite, because clearly Yeshayahu was the bigger prophet than Micha. Right. So we have that very often, and and I just want to mention something about the time period, because the parallel to Yirmiyahu was significant, because when we try and place Ovadia in a time frame, so there are two ideas offered, but the most logical one is that he is contemporaneous to Yirmiyahu, because the big sin of Edom here is that they basically helped the Babylonians to destroy the southern kingdom. Right. A little bit like, the Ukrainians helping the Germans in World War II, meaning they're a smaller nation, but they help the bigger nation to destroy. So the content of the prophecy really speaks to the fact that this is really being spoken right after the destruction, right in that end of that, imagine 586 BCE, around that time period. So the connection to Yirmiyahu is really important also to place the message of what he's saying.
So they're seeing something similar. Yirmiyahu is talking about the bigger picture, the Babylonian picture, and Ovadia is coming in and talking about the contribution of Edom to that destruction. It is worth noting, because there is someone that Achav is, Ovadia is a prophet who is Ovadia in the book of Malachim at the time of Achav. that is not accepted by Ibn Ezra. It's not accepted by Barbanel. In other words, other medievalists come in. But I just want to put that out there because people may be familiar with Rashi, and that maybe they may be thinking, wait a minute, how did we go from the kingdom of Achav to the prophecy of Yirmiyahu?
Exactly. So again, that earliest dating would make him sort of contemporaneous with Eliyahu, right? But the content of this prophecy really speaks to the fact that it's likely on the eve of the destruction of the southern kingdom and more contemporaneous with Yirmiyahu.
And that goes back to your point that we don't really know who this Ovadia is and where he lives. We don't have enough information, and we're trying to place him based on other factors that we're pulling from Sefer Malachim, Sefer Yirmiyahu. We know the latest that he could have lived, but we don't know exactly where he is.
Exactly. So when it comes to the messages or the main ideas that we have in this prophecy, so it opens with the idea that Edom is a haughty nation. And that's like a really big sin in the eyes of our first temple prophets is, you think you're so powerful, you're like a nesher, one of those words that's shared both by Yirmiyahu and Ovadia, and looking at Edom as sort of just being so confident in their success, but you should know that you will be defeated as well, and people will come and destroy you in the night. By the way, I'll just say now, because I know eventually we're going to go into a different direction, which is that we don't actually do this. We're not the ones in the end who defeat Edom. The defeat is actually committed by the Babylonians themselves. They conquer Edom, and so everything that's said here in this prophecy actually does come to fruition, but not because we're the ones who commit it in the way that it seems in this prophecy, but that, meaning they were helping the Babylonians, and then eventually the Babylonians turn on them because, well, they also want their territory. So there is this downfall that happens. So as I said before, the first 9 psukim of Ovadia really speaks about this haughtiness of Edom. And that's before we get to this very personalized sort of, this personalized shaming of Edom because they're connected to Esav.
So what's interesting with the word zadon or zadon libcha, which appears that your arrogant heart, it really speaks to Chazal as they're trying to think of what role Edom has had in our history going forward, not just looking back. And Edom becomes associated with Rome. It becomes associated with Christendom. Even though, Yosefa, you've told us that Babylonia essentially defeats Edom, the idea of Edom, the character or the impact of Edom gets translated into Rome and then Christianity. And when Chazal are thinking of a bracha, one of the blessings in the 18, which really become the 19th blessing, around the time that Christianity is really beginning to have impact, or heresy, whatever the minim, the heretics, those who dispute rabbinic Judaism, they go to Ovadia and they borrow this language of zadon libcha, your arrogant heart, to conclude the bracha machnia zedim, which really becomes, as I said, the 19th blessing. Where we say Shmona Esrei, it's really Cha'esrei, 19. And the idea that arrogance leads to an alienation, leads to a desire to destroy, not just physically, but spiritually, becomes reflected through the language of Ovadia to talk about this blessing that the Lamalshenim Alti Tikva, those who speak against us to the government, those who try to insinuate themselves within us and lead us astray, they should be destroyed, they should be eradicated, and so on, is inspired, I believe, from Ovadia.
Yeah. What's also interesting about that is that Ovadia is far from the only prophet to speak about haughtiness, meaning a more natural source of that, by the way, would be Yeshayahu. But there, he's speaking about the haughtiness of Am Yisrael. And so I think that Chazal, also because, again, of this very tense relationship with Christendom, as you've said, they dafka take it from Ovadia. We'll see also, Hanukkah is almost upon us, and there's also a reference to some things here in a song that we sing on Hanukkah. And so before I want us to explore more about this idea of Esav and Edom and how this gets sort of a new life or very difficult life is breathed into it through Chazal. So I just want to just look for a minute at the second part of this, again, very, very short prophecy, which essentially is saying that now that we've identified Esav as this brother, and as I said, that Michamas Achicha Yaakov Tichascha Busha, that because of the way you treated your brother Yaakov, you will then basically be defeated, that they're basically saying that ve'al tireh biyom achicha biyom nachro ve'al tismach livnei Yehuda biyom ovdam. And here it's saying, how could you have gazed with glee on your brother on that day, on their day of calamity, which again seems to be a reference to the fact that they were happy when the Babylonians defeated us. Again, if we're placing it in that time frame. And then essentially the sort of the measure for measure response is that, for example, in verse 15, Ki karov yom Adonai al kol hagoyim ka'asher asita ya'aseh lach gemulcha yashuv beroshecha. Right? You're going to get what you deserve. The Yom Hashem, which is this phrase we have in many of these prophets, especially in this time period of like this sort of divine day of judgment, that is going to come to you, and you are going to get exactly what you deserve. And on that day, just another example, I'm reading from verse 18. Yudchet v'haya beit Yaakov esh ubeit Yosef la'ava ubeit Esav lekash v'dalku bahem v'achalum. Again, it's very harsh imagery, right? But basically, Am Yisrael, both Beit Yaakov and Beit Yosef, the southern and northern kingdoms, are going to be like a flame and like a torch. And Esav, you are going to be like straw, and you will get devoured and burnt. Now, again, as I said, in reality, we weren't the ones who did this. It was actually the Babylonians. But that's the way it's presented here. And the last pasuk in the Haftorah is the one that, if we're familiar with any pasuk, we're familiar with this one, which is V'alu Moshiim Bahar Tzion Lishpot et Har Esav V'hayta LaHashem HaMenucha, that for liberators shall march on Har Tzion, the mountain of Zion, to wreak judgment on the mountain of Esav, and dominion shall be will belong to God. And this idea being that it's not just about defeating Edom. This is I would say, an age-old war, right, between Am Yisrael and between Esav. And so the interchange constantly between Edom and Esav here is very significant, and Chazal pick up on this in very, very strong ways.
Yeah, it's really what's going to lead to a retelling of the entire Yaakov Esav history through the lens of a prophet like Ovadia, also Malachi, also Amos. Ovadia is not the only one to really bring this kind of calamitous prophecy, this kind of denigration or hostility towards Edom, Esav, right? A merging between the two because of historically what has happened. But what ends up happening is it impacts midrashic reading of the biblical text, so much so that it's sometimes hard to peel it apart. I'll bring some examples, but one of the things I find today is that we often invite students to read the Pshat, to really read the story, the text as it appears in Torah, and they sometimes then are surprised that Yaakov's behavior is far from unscrupulous. In other words, there's a lot of manipulation, and there's lying, and there's a sense of, wait a minute, I've always read this story as Esav is the bad guy and Yaakov is the good guy. The story is much more interesting and much more complex than just a clear conflict between good and evil, and yet the Midrash over and over is going to turn it into that, so that you almost can't help but be biased. There's a Yaakov bias before we even get started.
Yeah, I just want to say that even stronger, which is that Esav seems to be a pretty solid man in the Psukim. Meaning, yes, he's not particularly interested in his role in the family, but his father, who we think of as one of our important patriarchs, as it says overtly, he favors him, and he obviously identifies with Esav in many ways, and maybe Dafka, the physicality of Esav. Yitzchak was also an Oved Adama. He wasn't a shepherd, and there were many parts of Esav. The fact that he comes home from going out for the hunt for days at a time when people wouldn't eat and comes home hungry, that shouldn't surprise us. The fact that he's willing to do anything at that moment, so yeah, maybe reflective of his personality. But in the end of the day, Esav doesn't seem to do anything all that bad until a moment where basically life has shifted, and then he wants to kill his brother in a way that we saw Cain wanted to kill his brother. I think very significant, though, is to note that he doesn't kill him. Meaning, as you said before, he doesn't do it.
He says, I'm going to wait till my father dies. He doesn't chase. His father does not die.
Yeah.
Years go by, at least, 22 years. And he does not say, okay, this is taking too long. He goes off and builds his life. And one more thing he does, which I think is very significant in the Parsha, is that his parents do not tell him they're displeased with the wives he's taken.
Right.
Nor do they marry him off.
Yeah.
And then when he realizes it, he goes and takes Basmat, the daughter of Yishmael, which leads you to wonder, why didn't they bring him the daughter of Yishmael years earlier? He is astute enough to be like, when he realizes something needs to be corrected, to correct it. I think that was a really good example. So, I would say Esav is not as bad as the Midrash is going to make him out to be, and Yaakov is not as good as the Midrash makes him out to be. Good and bad are too simplistic of terms to describe a family in which there's infertility, a family in which there's favoritism, and so on. And yet the Midrash is going to really create a binary characterization. So, and one of my suggestions is that Ovadia plays a role in that. The idea that Ovadia comes out and describes Esav as Edom in such uncomplimentary terms allows rabbinic interpretation to utilize some of that.
I just want to say one more piece here, which is that, because I don't want it to come out that we're sort of like blaming Ovadia. I think that Chazal take it and use it as an interpretive tool of their own. But I think the general question of why do we have prophecies of doom, I think in many ways are also meant to be comforts to Am Yisrael. Meaning, if you imagine the people that are hearing this, again, I don't know who they are really, but the people that are hearing this then we have nothing left. Right? We have nothing left. And so we look around and it's well before Christianity is going to exist and well before Esav is Christianity. But essentially we see that reality. Oh, we've been replaced. God doesn't want us, right? And we've already had earlier Haftorahs where we saw how the later chapters of Yeshayahu address this and the early prophets of the Second Temple. So Ovadia is kind of like on the forefront. He's at the beginning of this time period where we kind of say, maybe God's not interested in us anymore, which of course is going to be the claim that the Christians will make later. And so I think that an element of the prophecy of doom for Edom is ultimately, again, maybe we wouldn't formulate it this way today, but it's supposed to be a prophecy of comfort for Am Yisrael because we're in a moment of destruction. So I just want to put that in there in terms of how I think the original audience would have received this.
Absolutely. Oh, I absolutely agree. And, my suggestion when I give some examples from the Midrash is I think they're inspired. Right? There's a sense also we're in the aftermath of destruction and how are we going to tell our stories in the aftermath of that? And there's something comforting in Esav being wicked and Yaakov being good, because that goodness will triumph, right? The good will overcome. God will choose the good. God knows the difference between good and bad. I think it's a similar mindset in terms of smoothing over some of the rough edges, because people, when they're in a time of crisis and trauma, don't want rough edges. And we just have to look in the last 2 years with the war and the hostages, a lot of people pushed off any sort of real, housekeeping, if you will, or thinking about the complexity because we had to survive and we had to fight and we had to be resilient and so on. And I think the next period is going to be more complicated for us. I keep talking about these midrashim, so let me just give a few quick examples. We can already go back to Philo, who is really pre-midrashic. He's a Jewish philosopher in Egypt, and he describes as follows the conflict between Esav and Yaakov as already expressing itself in the womb, that Rivka feels within her the warring natures of good and evil. Right, so already what we're expressing is Esav's going to reflect evil, Yaakov's going to reflect good. And that idea that human beings are created of Yetzer Tov, Yetzer Ra, the good inclination, the bad inclination, which Philo speaks about philosophically, this idea that we wrestle with good and evil within us our whole lives is very prevalent in some of his work on the virtues. But then the personification of evil is Esav, the personification of good is Yaakov. And then if we get more into the midrashic text, this idea that righteous Jacob, who observes the entire Torah, that he's sitting in the tent and he's literate and he's learning. He's not even a shepherd at this point. He's just sitting and learning.
The Ishtam Yoshev Ohalim, which they turn it into a Beit Midrash.
And Esav becomes a hunter and he hunts birds and animals and he kills living things and he kills Nimrod and Nimrod's son. But Yaakov is perfect and studies in the Academy of Aver, and so on and so on and so forth. And so the idea of a hunter would have been thought of poorly. There's something very animalistic and primitive. In the Torah, I'm not sure you would think of a hunter poorly.
No.
He's someone who goes out and has the patience and the cunning to kill the animals that are going to then feed the household. Their skins are going to be used. The fat is going to be used as tallow. The animals that he's catching are not just to put a trophy on the on the wall, the head of the animal. It really is going to be very basic in terms of caring for the household. And yet the Midrash, of course, at this point, no one's going out hunting. And so the idea of a hunter becomes a very negative image. And the idea of a schoolmaster, the idea of a scholar, the idea of someone keeping his hands clean, so to speak, by learning the books is going to be very, very, very near and dear to them and very attractive.
I just want to point out to make sure that everyone is getting the point you're trying to make, which is that essentially you're saying is that the position of where Chazal are at this time in history is impacting the way that they're refracting these professions, right? In the world they're living in, no one is doing hunter-gathering anymore. You have the slaughterers, right? Slaughtering the cows, whatever it is, but they don't have that same kind of hunter-gathering lifestyle. And that enables one to look back at what used to be just a pragmatic way of functioning and say, oh, that's low or that's debased or primitive, when it probably didn't have that weight at all in the time of the Torah.
And even the idea that he was Admoni and Sa'ir, that he was ruddy and hairy, it suggests that he's the more robust baby.
Yeah.
There's something very physical, and it's possible that's why Yitzchak is drawn to him, because there's something of a Yitzchak is a survivor, and then this idea of this robust, strong, physical young man who can go out and provide for the family is a very compelling kind of image for a father who underwent whatever he underwent in his life, in addition to being an ish sadeh, right, being a man of the field.
Yeah.
What I'd really like to bring, Yosefa, and maybe even end with, is a beautiful midrash from Kohelet Rabbah. I believe it's chapter 10, and it's on the pasuk, Shlach lachmacha pnei hamayim, cast your bread upon the water, that it may come back to you. And there's a story there of Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, who's strolling on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, and he sees a ship that is sinking, and the only survivor is a man who gets washed ashore completely naked. And this man hides, on the seacoast. He wants to hide his nakedness. And the Midrash says it was the season when Jews ascend to Jerusalem for the pilgrimage festival. So even though Elazar ben Shamua, I believe, is post-destruction, the story and the way stories do kind of blur the timeline, and they're going up to the Mikdash, which has not yet been destroyed, but the Romans would have already been a thorn in our side. And he turns to them, the naked man, and says, I'm from the descendants of Esav, your brother. Give me some minimal garments, and I will cover my nakedness, as the sea stripped me bare, and I was left with nothing. And what they say to him is, may your entire nation be stripped bare in this manner. And they keep walking, and they leave him there. He lifts his eyes. He sees Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua. He says to him, you're an older and respected man. You are wise in the ways of the dignity of people. Of course, nakedness is the antithesis of dignity. And he says, I'm appealing to you. And perform charity for me, give me a covering, for the sea stripped me bare. And Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, who's wearing 7 garments, he removes one of his garments and gives it to him. But not only that, he takes him into his home, he feeds him, he gives him money, he transports him back to a place where he can get home, and he gives him great honor. Okay, and that's the end of the first part of the story. And he sees a naked human being in need, whereas all the pilgrims see a descendant of Esav, and they want to have nothing to do with him. Sometime later, the evil emperor died. The story continues as this story does, and they appoint a king, and they appoint none other than this naked descendant of Esav to become the king of the emperor of the province. And he has not forgotten the way the people of that province treated him. And he essentially sends out a decree that the men are to be executed and the women to be plundered. And they go to Elazar ben Shamua and they say, you really need to help us out here. And he says, this kingdom does nothing for free. They say, here, 4,000 dinar. And he goes to the king and he stands at the gate. There are a lot of similarities to the Esther story. And he says, tell him that there's a Jewish man standing at the gate. And the king says, bring him in. And the king gets off his throne and bows before Elazar ben Shamua and essentially says, what are you doing here? And he says, please have mercy. And I want to now read inside. He says to him, the evil emperor, the descendant of Esav, is there any untruth written in the Torah? And Rabbi Elazar says no. And he says, well, is it not in your Torah, an Ammonite and a Moabite shall not enter into the assembly of the Lord because they did not greet you with bread and water? Yes, that's true. And isn't it written, do not despise an Edomite as he is your brother? That's also true. Am I not a descendant of Esav? But they treated me like a descendant, like Ammon and Moab treated your people. They were the antithesis of what the Torah says you must do. And then he continues, one who violates the Torah incurs liability to be executed. He says, I'm now taking upon myself that role, and I'm going to execute them for violating their own Torah. It's such a powerful moment in the story that he uses our psukim to strip away, our own, what was really our own harshness, our own cruelty, our own inconsistency or hypocrisy. And he says, I should not be treated this way.
He's also bringing a pasuk that we didn't bring until now, which is from a different place in the Torah, of that we shouldn't hate Edom, right?
Yes.
The idea that we shouldn't hold that grudge forever, which let's just take that, his question even further, seems to slightly be at odds with our prophecy from Ovadia, meaning the prophecy of Ovadia. Maybe it doesn't say to hate, and maybe that's going to be the answer, but it certainly says that we will be very happy at the downfall of Edom. And so that is a question in of itself, meaning how is Ovadia, how does that fit in with this idea?
We also didn't bring the pasuk from Malachi that says God hates Esav.
Yes.
Also a very complicated statement. But nonetheless, the Torah, which is true, which is eternal, which is something we turn to for direction more than the prophets, because the prophets are at a specific place and time, says that we are not to hate or despise the Edomite, because regardless of our history, that brotherly relationship, those two souls that shared a womb, two souls who were birthed by Yitzchak and Rivka, there's something in that relationship that cannot be completely severed or destroyed, despite the prophecies, despite Ovadia and Malachi. And Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua basically does not try to defend them. He says, you're absolutely right. Mm-hmm. They've incurred liability, but I'm asking you to have mercy. And he does, right? He shows this incredible compassion despite his, so to speak, righteousness, and despite that they have treated him like Ammon and Moab treated us, right? It's really quite powerful. And he rewards, of course, Elazar ben Shamua, and the pasuk ends, cast your bread on the surface of the water, that it may return to you.
Right. Meaning be nice always, right?
In this case, literally bread.
Yeah, literally bread, but meaning help people always, because you never know when it'll be helpful. Meaning we're doing it to be nice, but it also might save your life at some point. I want to just for a moment look at this idea, meaning what we're basically saying is that we have a command in the Torah not to hate, right? Not to hate Esav. And then we have prophecies from a time period where, as I said, the Jewish people felt utterly abandoned. And I think that piece is important, because I think putting those prophecies, while we do believe that prophecies have an eternal element to them, that their context is very important, understanding that it was some sort of inner dialogue that was supposed to be comforting. But then we see in the midrash, we have basically the midrash you just brought, which I didn't know until you had showed it to me, and then other midrashim which further the dichotomy between Yaakov and Esav, right? This is a midrash that says, be careful about that. Be careful, because you might make a very, very bad mistake when you conceive of them as an object of your hate. But we have many other midrashim, as we said, who looking at the descendants of Esav, Edom, i.e. Christendom, that then sort of, and again, I would say as a coping mechanism for the fact that we were being murdered and slaughtered by who we looked at as descendants of. But I think what we're bringing up here, and I think what is a very nuanced approach, is to say that this is a complex thing, and we have to be careful about our rhetoric, because the rhetoric that's offered by the prophets can inspire generations of an approach or a perspective that might send us into a dangerous direction.
Absolutely, and I'll tighten a little bit. The prophets continue to inspire us. They're descriptive and they're relevant for all time. The Torah gives a command. There's a tzivui, there's a mitzvah. And as a result, its language is different and binding in a different way. And I think that command overrides the descriptiveness or the punishment or the consequence. All of that is fine and reflected that reality and reflects what happens when our enemies seek to persecute us, even if they are descendants of Edom. Yeah. But overriding that, Elazar ben Shamua reminds us through the language of this nobleman that the words of the Torah are true, and if there's a tzivui, then there are times we're going to have to push aside that bias and that sense of rejoicing over the downfall of enemy and look at them as our brothers. And that's complicated. And I think we're seeing some of that today in the aftermath, or as we, at this stage of history, how do we deal with people who are not from, how do others deal with us, but how do we deal with the other?
Nechama, I think where this conversation is bringing us back to is that moment of the surprise hug, as we said, the surprise embrace between Esav and Yaakov. And I think that, while we're here exploring the Haftorah, but this Haftorah is so intrinsically connected to the Parshat that I want to jump back to the Parshat for 1 second, which is this idea of the Sefer Breishit tells us over and over again, through the example of Yaakov and Esav, through the example of Yosef and his brothers, that siblings who don't get along don't have to be next door neighbors, right? You don't have to share a life together if that's not what's good for the personalities between you and the way that your history has developed. But we do need to treat everyone with decency and respect, which is what we see Esav and Yaakov doing with one another. They don't end up living together. Yaakov doesn't go and visit him, but there is some sort of a closure that happens. And also in the case with Yosef and his brothers, right? That he takes care of them, he cares for them, he does not live close to them, and they don't trust him up until the end because they think that he's going to want to kill them, right? Once their father dies. And then he does the same thing that Esav does. And he says, I don't want to kill you, right? That's the last chapter in Breishit.
He cries.
He cries and he embraces him and he says, I don't want to kill you. That is not where this is going. And each time we're both repairing the Cain and Hevel story, right? And it's also saying that it doesn't mean that it then has to fit together perfectly, but it just has to be a relationship of respect and of caring for one another, right? That the giving the bread or giving somebody clothing is not just it's not just an external expression. It's really, really deep, because maybe we don't have the wherewithal to be close emotionally, but we can always care for a relative. We can always give them things that they need. And that very often is enough when a relationship is not what we're actually able to establish. And I think that that's an important piece also to take away from this sort of this complex relationship between the Yaakov and Esav story and how it gets refracted both through the prophecy of Ovadia and then later on through the midrashim of Chazal. And I encourage everyone who's listening who kind of maybe grew up on these midrashim and never really thought about them in that kind of way, as you encounter them from now on, it's really important to think about that, to think about what period in history are the writers of that midrash in, right? What experience are they having with Christendom in the world that really was persecuting us for many, many, many years, and that we required some sort of internal rhetoric in order to survive, as you said, that period of time. I love this conversation. It went in ways that I think were surprising and really enriching for this one chapter, Book of Ovadia.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Nechama. Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.